I'm so happy to introduce our panelists for our next panel discussion. It's going to be based around our curated space on Inuit prints and drawings from Canada. I want to say how deeply grateful we are to Pat Feheley, Mark London, Elise Jacobson, and their team for organizing such a beautiful presentation that our visitors are greeted with as soon as they enter the fair. Well, okay, you can clap for that. While artists like Annie Putuguk and more recently Shuvani Ashuna have certainly broken through the doors of the art world, Inuit art is an entire genre with a rich history that we're still eager to share with the outsider art fair community and beyond. I really want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Lawrence Benenson, Susan Harris, and Susan Weiler. And now I'm going to introduce our panel. We are especially grateful to Mary-Dailey Desmarais, the João Ionescu Chief Curator at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal, for making the trip to moderate this panel. I urge everyone to visit this world-class institution and world-class city. Mary has been overseeing major reinstallations of the museum's Inuit collection. The exhibition Rising Suns, Art from the Confederacies of the Great Lakes and Rivers is now on view through October 11th, and then she's curating Alison Katz's Jeu d'Esprit, which opens October 9th. Other of Mary's exhibitions include Basquiat and Music and Nalini Milani, Crossing Boundaries, both in 2023. Patricia Feheley is the founder and owner of Feheley Fine Arts in Toronto. She has been a champion of early and contemporary Inuit art for decades and was awarded the Order of Canada for her advocacy in 2021. Pat is a member of the Art Dealer Association of Canada. Jessica Winters is a self-taught painter and textile artist from Nunatsiavut, Labrador. Her imagery symbolizes grounding and memory, stills from the land and childhood. Her practice includes painting, drawing, and textiles. The artist works from her studio in St. John's, Newfoundland. Winters is 2022 recipient of the Hanatchin Foundation Saunderson Prizes for Emerging Artists, and her work can be seen in collections across Canada. Margarita Lizcano Hernandez is a curatorial assistant of drawings and prints at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. And Ed Guarino is a retired teacher and collector of Native American and Inuit art for close to 50 years. And finally, the fair would like to express special thanks to our Canadian friends for being here at a time when many of their compatriots are reluctant to visit our country. So let's give everybody a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you to my fellow panelists for being here today. Thank you to all of you also for being with us. It's great to see so many new faces for me here and to be with you all this afternoon to speak about the beautiful booth that Feheley Fine Arts has put together. Pat asked me, by way of intro, to talk a little bit about my own relationship with Inuit art. As Andrew mentioned, I'm the João Ionescu Chief Curator at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. I'm actually a 19th century person by academic training. But wait, I'm going to put on, of course I've lost the clicker. It was somewhere. Is it in my lap? Hold on. Yes, there we go. Very useful and surprising given it's me. But anyway, to talk about my relationship to Inuit art, and actually, funnily enough, so I was born and raised in New York City. I now live in Montreal. My first introduction ever to Canadian art was through Inuit art. My husband, now husband, when we met, he introduced me to Inuit art, and I found it actually really fascinating. And through that first introduction, I think it was really Kanuiwak and Shuvani for me that kind of sparked this interest, which really was a personal passion. As I said, I'm not somebody who's expertly trained at all in this material. But together we really wanted to support Canadian artists, and we particularly wanted to support Inuit artists, and I had the great pleasure when I finally finished my PhD dissertation, and I thought, you know, if we want to do something to kind of celebrate this mammoth, soul-sucking enterprise being over, what should we do? And we decided to go to Kingate with Pat, actually. And I had the immense privilege of meeting Shuvania Shuna when I was there. So you can see that's a picture of her and me hugging, actually, in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. I'm showing you an installation photo of, well, two actually, of our recent reinstallation of our Inuit art collection, which was led by a wonderful Inuit artist called Isinayak, who brought a completely different perspective to the collection. That's something we can talk about later, but working with a person who is from the North, who is Inuk, who had a completely different way of approaching and sharing this work, was such an eye-opening and really transformative experience, not just for me, but for the whole museum. So I had the great pleasure of supervising that installation, and Asiniak won an award for it, and so we were all very happy, and it was wonderful also to be able to have so many artists from the North come down at that time, and that was very special. So my relationship to Inuit art is, yes, on the one hand, professional in some ways, but it's also a deeply personal passion, and I'm so happy to be here to discuss this subject with all of you today. So that's enough about me. Let's go forward. Pat, as you know, not all of the audience here, certainly not all of New York, not all the visitors to the Outsider Art Fair are really familiar with the history of the development of Inuit art. And in some ways, your booth is kind of like an intro course of major trends, let's say, or veins, moreover, it's probably better said, of Inuit art practices and all their varied richness. I'd love for you to start and kind of just walk us through the early years of the development of the printmaking community in Kingate, how that happened. I put on the screen in this first slide a work by Kunuiwak Ashevak that's in your booth, and also the Canadian postage stamp, because her work became so well known that for many people, Kunuiwak became a kind of, and particularly her enchanted owl, became a kind of symbol of Canada. So please, starting with this, talk to us a little bit about the development of printmaking practices in the North.
Yeah, thank you, Mary-Dailey. We wanted to show from the beginning as much as we could up to the present, which is difficult in a small presentation, but although the Inuit had done, they had incised images on ivory, they had, decorations in clothing or tattoo marks. So there was a graphic history, but the whole concept of drawing on paper, and in particular printmaking, was introduced. It was introduced in the late 1950s, at a time when there was enormous social change in the Arctic, and frankly began as an economic development program. Sponsored by the federal government, who set up cooperatives, and the cooperatives then set up an art studio. And this is the original, if you can see on the left of this, that was the original 512, which was the prefab building size, that all of the prints up until, 64 or so, were made. It was just a tiny little space. And on the right, you can see two of the stonecutters working on cutting the stone for a print by Kunuiwak Ashevak. So it started with the art advisor giving people pincers and papers, and that they would take them out to their camps and bring the drawings back. And then he had the idea to start printmaking. And since there's not a lot of wood in the Arctic because there's no trees. So what they did was they adapted the woodcut technique and the woodcut studio technique. They actually took it from the Japanese model, but used local stone, made it flat, and that's where the relief printing was done. So it was very simple, and between that and stencil, those were the start. So the piece that you saw a minute ago was done in stencil and was Kanoyuak's very first piece. This is a stone cut. So again, you can see how perfectly, even at this point, how perfectly the printing was. How they really excelled at the excellence of printing, even under such what could only be called primitive conditions. The one on the left, which is still my very favorite, just gives you an idea of subject matter. Some of the subject matter was coming from their heads, was fantasy. Some of it came from their lifestyle, the desire to show traditional life. The guy on the left is shown standing with his hands up, and the title is Joyfully I See 10 Caribou. And in fact, when they went out hunting as a group, they would follow the caribou, and then what they would do is when they got to where they thought they were, one person would climb up the hill, just carefully peek over, and then indicate to the others whether there were caribou there or not. And so he held up all 10 fingers and said, "Joyfully I see 10 caribou." So, I mean, it was quite literally at this point about their life and, or as I say, fantasy, fantasy visions.
And Margarita, if I'm not mistaken, the MoMA was actually collecting around this time, which would have been very early, particularly in relationship to or in comparison to other American museums at this time, because really they're buying work at the time when this print community is developing. So can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be and how those works from the late 50s, early 60s came to enter into the collection?
Yeah, and I think, before I kind of start, I have to give a really big shout out to my colleagues in the department, Kumbioni, Omar Diet, who have been tirelessly, alongside with me, sort of making sure that all these works are imaged, available on our website, that the annotated names are also available for the artists. So, but MoMA's engagement with Inuit prints started in the late 1950s when Bill Lieberman and at the time Ariva Castleman, who was a curatorial assistant, were planning and organizing Canada 67, which was sort of the first exhibition dedicated to Canadian artists to commemorate the centennial of Canada. And there was a previous exhibition also before then in '63 that was mounted under the auspices of MoMA's International Council. But sort of the lead up to 1967 really pushed Bill Lieberman, who was the chief curator of the Prints and Illustrated Books department at the time, to really try and search for what does Canadian art look like today. So the museum was able to acquire 10 stone-cut and stencil prints in 1960, all of them from the 1959 first annual print editions rollout. And later on, in 1965, we acquired another 10 woodcut prints and stencils from 1963. And that sort of makes the bulk of MoMA's collection, which is really quite a treasure trove in the sense that, 4 of the prints that were acquired then were included in Canada 67 exhibition. So I think there was a real interest in really trying to figure out what does printmaking look like today, not just, within New York City or the US, but also internationally in a wider scope. Mm-hmm. And that really became the impetus for the foundation for MoMA's collection.
And I know that you've actively yourself had an important role in collecting more recent work by living artists in the North. I'm going to, for a second though, I do want to stay on some of this earlier work and make sure that, Pat, we talk about such important figures as Jesse Unark and Par and Pudo Pudlad before we get a bit more recent in time.
Well, the Kingnight, or most of you would know it as Cape Dorset, is a small settlement on the southwest side of Baffin Island. It started, as I showed you, with a small studio, and it was the first of the printmaking areas. So at that point, there was another artist, very well known, in a totally different settlement, quite far away. And they tried an experiment where they actually brought drawings by Jesse Unark over and made them into prints in Cape Dorset. So that almost established that Cape Dorset was sort of the center of printmaking at that time. And Jesse Unark's style was quite different. Even the clothing patterns are different from Dorset. As we moved sort of through the next 4 or 5 years, there was a flowering of, first of all, artists' personal styles being recognizable, so that the piece on the right was by an elder whose name was Parr, and he had a very rough way of drawing. And if you think about the Canada geese that we just saw, you know that they could make stone cut perfect. So the brilliance of this is that the stone cutter was replicating the very rough lines of his drawing. So, individual styles were slowly emerging from, in these annual collections that were released once a year in October.
I wanted to loop you in, Jessica, to this discussion because we've been talking about Kingite, we've been talking about federal assistance for or involvement in the development of the print community there or art making community there. And you were telling me earlier, which actually I really didn't know that aspect of the history, that Labrador, where you're from, Nunatsiavut, was completely left out. So I'd love to hear your perspective as somebody who's from there and how you relate to that history.
Yeah, so I didn't really see art like this growing up, basically until I had access to internet. Not because there wasn't art in my community. There's a ton of art, and I grew up in a family of artists, but it looked a lot different because we didn't have that, I guess that we're part of that program. So basically, Labrador was a part of Newfoundland, and Newfoundland didn't join Confederation until 49. And then after that, the federal government still took a long time to recognize Nunatsiavut as an Inuit region. So we're kind of left out of that whole movement. So yeah, the art looks very different in my region, and people don't really practice the printmaking. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important because when we were talking earlier, I so appreciated your comments. And it's something that I spoke a lot about with Asinayak, who again was the curator of the recent installation that I showed you. For people from what are called the South in Canada, which means not the Arctic regions, it's far too often Inuit people are kind of grouped together as being all one, and Inuit art is this or it's that. But in fact, as we're going to see today, and as your work shows so well, there's such a diversity and richness in the artistic practices that are happening today, and also in the history. So I wanted you to talk about that too. Before we get into again some more recent work, I wanted to stop on this work by Pudlo Pudlad. We've seen previous to this a lot of more kind of joyful images. This work surprised me. What I know of Pudlo is actually some of his really wonderfully colorful rainbow drawings and prints with airplanes and all kinds of things. This opens up to a little bit a little bit of violence, quite frankly, in domestic life at the time. It's called Reluctant Wife. Perhaps, Pat, you could talk about this print, which leads us into some of the themes that are treated in more recent work and more recent scenes of daily life.
Yeah, it was in that first decade, from 59 to 69, you were dealing primarily with elders and people who'd lived most of their life on the land. And they did not depict some of the darker side of life on the land, for sure. And so this is an unusual print from 1961. It was apparently quite common that if somebody wanted to take as a wife someone from another camp, they would just go and take her and kidnap her, which, again, this recurred several times in art. But this is a surprising image for 1961. And surprising, you're right, for Pudlo as well. But it was quite different from the subject matter that you were seeing until much later, until 2 decades later.
We're jumping way forward in time, but I thought that scene by Pudlo was kind of an interesting segue into what somebody like Annie Putuguk did, which was to really turn attention to everyday life, like the simplicities, sometimes the banalities, sometimes the violences of everyday life. I love this work that you have in your booth, Pat, which has, as Jessica was pointing out when we were looking at it together, so many of the little details that might really resonate with somebody who's from there. You know, the TV, the VCR, the books, one that says cartoon, one that says exorcism in there. You can't really see it here. I'd love you to talk about, and Ed, I have a question for you after this, but I'd like to return to you, Jessica, to ask you what this work meant for you as a young artist when you came into contact with it.
Yeah, I think I first seen this in your house. Yeah. This work for me is so important because I feel like it allows the artist, or Annie in this case, to exist as she sees herself as a community member, not as maybe she is portraying herself as an artist for Southern people. And it really just, like, to appreciate the mundane daily life, this is what it means to be Inuk in 2006. And that's kind of where I'm heading in my work is, how do I create pieces that people from my community can appreciate and that talk about, Inuit, Indigenous people, we're multifaceted just like you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Ed, I want to turn to you. You're somebody who has been collecting this work since the 90s, I think, maybe even before.
Yeah, the 90s.
And you have, Pat was telling me, an extraordinary collection of work that is both more historic, so dating from earlier in the 20th century, in the 60s, up through Annie and Chauvenai, etc. So I love to talk, just to ask you as a collector, what drew you to these different time periods, what kind of things you might see in terms of the arc of your collection and what you pull out, because you're also someone who writes about Inuit art, you're a teacher, so I'd love to hear your stories about your collection and what the threads are that you're seeing in the different kinds of work you've collected over the years.
The first works on paper I collected were by Janet Kaguziak, and I was fascinated by her work because of the multiple perspectives and the inclusion of writing in the work, which, coming from a European background and studying European art, that was unusual. It exists, but it's rare. So that fascinated me, and I started collecting works on paper, and then I realized I have to get more than Janet, and I started looking at other artists, mostly Cape Dorset. And I also was fascinated by the earlier works, which I was unaware of them. And so I thought, well, that needs to be in my collection as well. And then I saw an exhibit at the McMichael, and it featured Pitsiolikashuna, Napachi Putuguk, and Chauvenai. And it dealt with some of the darker aspects of Inuit life, and I had never seen that before. And I just felt, well, my collection needs to reflect all of Inuit life to be a good collection. And so I started consciously acquiring works that dealt with darker aspects. And so that's very much along with the happier aspects of life. The darker aspects are also reflected in the collection. So I wanted it to be a well-rounded collection. So a lot of collectors, they're only interested in pretty pictures of life as it used to be lived on the land, or pictures of beautiful animals. And there's way more to Inuit art than that.
I think a good example of that, and thank you, I'll get back to that picture, is this work which is currently in your booth, Pat. Do you want to tell us about this? And anybody else who's on the panel, please feel free to jump in, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular drawing.
Yeah, well, Annie more or less led the way in that she spoke about, she did these horrifying drawings of her being beaten, for instance, by her partner with a piece of wood, or breaking her parents' alcohol bottles. This is just a very straightforward piece of people carrying suicides, is how it was described to me. The suicide rate up there is appallingly high and remains appallingly high. And it was a fact, literally, of everybody's life every day. But that, again, would never have appeared in art, I think, before Annie and Juvenai came along and were quite willing to, to show that. And to show it, in what surprises me about this drawing is it's so almost matter of fact. There's not even a lot of emotion in it. And so as much as Annie lying on the floor watching Dr. Phil on TV, this is another just aspect of life at the time in the North.
Does anybody else want to make any comments?
Well, one
on
thing
this?
I find interesting is the subject matter is so dark, but the colors are very bright. So it's even more disturbing.
Yeah, very interesting contrast. Did you want to say something, Margarita?
No, I think it's just the way that Juvenai Ashuna kind of has been known or more broadly sort of encountered in the international stage, I think particularly being part of the Venice Biennial a couple of years ago. People normally think of her work as sort of these fantastical, beautiful, strange creatures and settings, but I think, that duality between sort of going really introspectively into her own world, but then also being very frank about the world that she lives in and as she sees it, I think is one of the many gifts that her work has to offer for just anybody sort of really interested in understanding not only Inuit art, but also Inuit life and communities and culture.
Absolutely, and I wanted to bring those works in because, well, as you have said so eloquently, all of you, in different ways, the art is not about one thing and the life is not about one thing. And these artists are touching on the diversity of experience in the North, and I hardly wanted to cast the notion, which unfortunately has happened in the South in Canada, of a kind of, dismal picture. Yes, we know the reality of the suicide rate, which is very important to acknowledge, but there's also so much joy and storytelling and community, which certainly really resonated to me, again, not being expert, but on a personal level when I went there. Again, I was there in June, not in January, but as you were saying, Margarita, just now, Juvenai's work can take on these cosmic, fantastical elements, but part of what makes it so distinctive, and I think has helped her get out into the international market, is the kind of variety of that practice and the storytelling element here. I'll turn it over to, here you mentioned her presentation of the Venice Biennale. This really had never happened. I mean, for those of you who might not know, the Venice Biennale, which is actually coming up very soon in May, is kind of like the Olympics of art. So countries from around the world get juries together and choose, the best or most representative artist at that time, or the artist with whom they would like to make a statement relative to their country. And these artists go on the world stage, and within that context, there is a curated section, and a whole portion of it was dedicated to Juvenai. Annie Putuguk, I should mention, was featured also in Documenta, and I believe that was 2008, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around there. Documenta being another major exhibition on the world stage. It only happens once every 5 years. It's a huge honor to be included. That exhibition actually came into being in the wake of World War II, when artists, philosophers were asking, how can art be made? How can there be poetry? How can there be creativity after the atrocity of World War II? And Documenta was kind of a response to that, an artistic response to that, and Annie's work featured in a very famous edition of Documenta. And the MoMA has recently acquired, and I know, again, Margarita, you've played an important role on this, work by Juvenai. I'm curious if you could tell us why these particular works. You've said a little bit about what drew you to her practice. We as curators know what it's like to make a choice when you have, and also, collectors, it's much the same. You have a choice between so many fantastic things, or among so many fantastic things. What was it about these works that you felt was most resonant in the MoMA collection?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, MoMA does have a history and sort of in its collection, sort of the earliest prints that were coming out from King 8 particularly. So trying to figure out and sort of look at, Chauvenay and her drawings in a way that would resonate not only with the collection that we have, but also just, who she is as an artist and the foundations of where she came from. So the 2006 My Drawing, it kind of links back to the first drawings and prints that she did in the 90s after living a very nomadic lifestyle for her first 30 years, where she would only use black ink and pen. I think particularly this is with ink. And I think one of the traits, or one of the things that's so beautiful about this particular drawing, is that you kind of get to see sort of inklings of nodes that she would continue to develop in the rest of her career. So, for example, the multiple vignettes sort of happening all across the page, sort of mimicking her own realization or kind of acknowledgement of her oeuvre, but also the fact of like pinning drawings up for collectors to come see, or kind of people holding up drawings as Southerners came to visit their communities. You also have like very stark, straightforward images like the Nord Air plane, which, it's very indicative of the fact that, the only way to get into King 8 and out is through air, and anything that is brought there has to be brought in through a plane, literally. But then also the fantastical elements, sort of this ambiguous like animal creature kind of waving at the viewer, and then egg, which also becomes such an iconic sort of image that she continues to explore later on in her career, that is really like a symbolism of life, of becoming, of emerging. And I think, Full Moon, which is a little bit later, a couple years later from the other drawing, it's sort of one of the first drawings where you really see the inkling of her kind of really diving into colored pencils and inks. And then the cyclical sort of the narrative that's told there, I think, is something that, as beautiful as the drawing is, it's also quite, dark. It's the cycle of life. You have a walrus emerging from a tundra, biting the goose's neck, who is biting a fish, so there's like this like food chain happening, and the cyclical resonance of life and death occurring all at once, as a matter of fact, with a human woman dressed in an amauti, which is an Inuit traditional parka. And I think what was also so interesting about these particular drawings is the size of them. I think we think of Chauvenay as working with really large, sort of almost cinematic drawings, but with these are such
There's
more
her
intimate.
working. I want to let you finish.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say there's her working to, as per your point, I mean, she's laid out across the drawing table.
Yeah,
Keep
and
going.
it's like became a very Chauvenay-esque. I mean, even like the marks that she did around the pebbles, like it's a very Chauvenay-esque now sort of motif or sort of texture that she's since developed into these larger drawings. But really seeing that happen in a much more intimate setting was really fascinating. I think also just someone like Chauvenay, despite the fact that she has garnered so much attention in recent decades, it was fitting to bring her work into the collection, particularly given the fact that her grandmother, Pitsiolakashuna, and Kiwakashuna, her father, was also, has been and was included in MoMA's collection in the 60s. So I think that lineage or that thread of connectivity is something that is really important, as well as a collection.
I want to talk with all of you actually about this question of family. You may have seen just in the course of these slides a few Ashuna, Ashevak, Pityolak, different family names that have produced kind of generations of artists. And I know, Ed, in your own collection, you have the entire family lineages. I guess I'd be interested, I'm kind of throwing this question of family out there. Well, maybe I'll turn to you, Ed. I mean, why was it important for you to have multiple family members, and what does the work by those family members that you have collected indicate to you about the nature of community and art making?
Well, the concept of family, being Italian American, is very important to me. We have a saying, la familia è tutti, family is everything. So when I come across an art movement, if you will, that focuses on family, it's very appealing to me. So as I started to collect and I started to see the relationships among the various artists, I wanted that to be reflected in the collection. So I very often would start by collecting one family member, and as I discovered that family member was related to someone else who was an artist, I would acquire that family member's work. I first started collecting work by Pizziolik, Ashuna, and then I learned that she was related to Annie, and I started collecting Annie's work. And then when Annie passed, Shuv and I had been overshadowed, and then suddenly people were interested in Shuv and I's work, but I had been collecting Shuv and I's work early on because I found it so fascinating and because she was related to these other artists. I like the idea that they also very often work together. And so obviously they were talking back and forth and they were close, so that intrigued me.
I wonder, Pat, if you could talk a little bit about the community around the Print Center in Kingate, because just in my own time there with you, you see different family members coming and going and making art together. There's a role, whether or not someone is an artist, at least in that community, and I want to ask about your experience, Jessica, which I'm sure is different. There's a kind of community support there that I found really interesting, and I'd love to ask you about that. You who've gone so many times up to Kingate, and you know so many of the artists there, what you see about the communal aspect of making art going to the Print Center.
Well, it's surprising that it's just very accepted that, I mean, we do know that they have the highest per capita number of artists of anywhere in the world. But within the community, the people do respect artists. And I know Annie, whose grandmother was so famous and was famous in her own time, and whose mother was getting to be well known, and whose, her uncles, and her father were all very well known, carvers. But in one of the films made about Annie, she's actually in that building on the right, and she's saying, "An artist. They think I'm an artist. Wow, that's really something." So she wasn't. She was in awe of the people before her who created art, but there's also that kind of feeling of, am I? Can I be an artist? And there's an enormous amount of support just for it, and respect. And sometimes you'll be talking to the brother of, who said, I wish I could have been an artist, but I can't, and therefore I hunt, or whatever. And and even in older people, I mean, Huvianatuk had not drawn in his life at age 59, because he was one of the great hunters. He had to have a hip replaced, and his cousin Jomi gave him some paper and said, "Why don't you try drawing?" And of course, he now has had several solo exhibitions, and is very, very well known. We've shown his art here. So it just is a way of life and a way of families being there.
Jessica, can you talk about how your experience as an artist in the Natsiavut might be similar or different?
Very similar, yeah. So my grandmother, my Nantiak, she was taught by her mother how to sew. So a lot of I think of a lot of artists' journey starts with crafting and making functional items for daily life. And then so when she was in residential school, they used to make all the children embroider these little inukuluk scenes that we call them. Just, you know, like people making igloos and playing ball and stuff on all these like tablecloths and things. So from a very young age, she was taught, you know, that to be creative, if you're ever bored, you make something. And then that's how she raised her child. And then that's how I was raised. So it was never, you know, go play with games or whatever. It was, you know, what can you make today? Draw me a picture, make me an ornament for my house. So yeah, very similar. And then also the same where people have a really difficult time calling themselves artists in Nunavut. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're talking about making all kinds of things. We've been talking today mostly about prints and drawings, and I want to get into an element. We'll skip over this new print center. I'll just quickly say that I included these beautiful works in Pat's booth, again, for this family element, and also the interest of the mixed media here, or mixed media references through the sculpture showing a drawing made by wood. Ikayukta have been Uvilu's grandmother?
No, mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law, okay. So showing a drawing by a family member in stone, which is kind of an interesting mixture of motifs and media contained within a single work. But, you know, it'd be easy to think that, you know, Inuit art is prints and drawings. You're, Jessica, someone who's working in textiles and painting. There's this beautiful collage, which you have to go see in Pat's booth. Tell us about these, Pat, these works by Barry Potter, which are photographs. So a lot of emerging photographic practices I'm seeing.
Very much so. Film, video, performance, photography for sure. And there has been a change. I mean, these later works are more recent. And, you know, most of the works earlier were made by people who lived in the Arctic, in their communities full time. But now many artists are living in southern Canada. Jessica can speak to that. But still, their work very much resonates, I think, back to culture. In this case, in the 1950s, the federal government went round and to the camps and gave everybody this tag to wear around their neck that had a number, and they phonetically tried to write down the person's name. And so, but a lot of the early sculptures, rather than signing their name in either Inuktitut or English, they're signed by their disc numbers. So it's kind of like an identity given to them by the Southerners. And so Barry Potter, who is also from Nunatsiavut, was fascinated with the history, and he collected, a whole family had kept theirs. So he had 10 of them. And so he did this photography of the 10, really, they're almost like still lives of the discs. And then he did 10 portraits of 10 Inuit people living in the South and their reactions to it. And they ranged from one of the sculptors who was furious and had his record expunged, down to one of the younger women actually had her disc number put on a T-shirt and was wearing it very proudly. But again, it's new media, but it's also that commentary on what happened, on the background, which becomes a major part of Inuit culture, all of the changes and this kind of thing. So it really is, going from just showing the dark side of older life, this enters into the dialogue that that Indigenous people are having, throughout Canada.
These are works by an artist she's the granddaughter of great-granddaughter of Jesse Unark. And in some ways, these works, if I'm not mistaken, kind of look back stylistically a little bit to Jesse's work, and yet speak so powerfully, I find, to community. This is the first work on the right that the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts acquired. It's the first ceramic made by an Inuit artist that we acquired. It's installed in the space that I showed you in the first slide, and we have probably one of the most important works on paper and sculptural collections of Inuit art in the country, and we're really trying to diversify our holdings now going forward, and that's one of the things that this acquisition has helped us to do. I would love to pass it over to you, Jessica, to tell us about the kind of work you're making. This is also, paintings. Yours was among, it's not this work, but we have also one of Jessica's paintings up in our museum galleries at this moment, and it was one of the first paintings by an Inuit artist that we acquired. And that was very recently. This was all within the last 3 years. So tell us about your work. Tell us about this, which you can see also downstairs.
I feel like people's perception of the North can sometimes be quite negative, and I want to appreciate also, Chauvenay and those artists kind of illustrating Inuit life for what it is in their experience. I think it is super important not to filter yourself and to show kind of every aspect. But for me, I've lately been interested in, the darkness, the coldness of my home and of my growing up in Nunavut, but in a way that is translated as coziness and homeness. So yeah, I kind of did these paintings knowing that Southerners or people who have not sort of experienced a cold October night in Nunavut, they might not quite understand it or get the same reaction, but that people from Makhovik would feel very comforted by.
Reference photo here. It's amazing what you've done with the light, and I love how you talk about it in terms of coldness feeling warm in a kind of way. So where's this exactly?
Yeah, so this is in Makhovik as well. So this is my mom and my Uncle Harold walking to church on Christmas Eve. Again, absolutely freezing, dark. This is 4 p.m. But literally the best day of the year, and you're with your family all day. So people from home really like this painting, which for me is like sort of the purpose of my work. My work is just a tribute to my community and my family, but in a way that is deeply personal to me, that is difficult for me to do, that is challenging, that I can be proud of technically.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think, Pat, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say that just talking about the southern reaction, and by the way, when we say southern, we're referring to southern Canada or anywhere below the tree line. This painting has been hanging as part of an exhibition in the National Gallery of Canada, so it's appreciated by people in the south as much as in the north. Yes,
I do appreciate all the institutions and people that are receiving this work well, and I also want to shout out to people like Asiniak. It's so important to have people, to have Inuit in these positions in museums and institutions. That gives space for people like me who are doing things a little bit unconventional or different, sort of trying to live outside of the box of what it means to be an Inuk artist, and supporting us and giving us space.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's the perfect note to open it up for questions from the floor, to let you have the last word. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your thoughts and expertise this evening. Thank you. And we're happy to take questions. I can repeat if people can't hear. Did everybody hear the question more or less? And, I'll just give the big lines of the, sorry, I'm confusing my French and English. I can't remember how to speak English anymore. The main thrust of your question, which is how art practices like the ones that we're seeing on the screen or the ones that we've looked at today might converge or diverge with some practices that are more object tool-based, one might say craft-based in certain ways, where there are intersections and divergences in those practices from other cultures, other indigenous cultures, if I'm understanding you correctly. Is that more or less? And storytelling. And what we can do is pass one of these mics around to whoever would like to ask a question next. Go ahead.
Well, I would just, one of the things I would say is that an awful lot of Canadian Inuit art is storytelling. It's just storytelling visually as opposed to, as opposed to the spoken word, as it were. But I know that the elders all grew up hearing the stories of, not to the myths and legends, but also of their ancestors. And so there is that aspect there of preserving, which storytelling does as well, of preserving culture. I don't know if anybody else has something to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes me think of the true interdisciplinarity of a lot of artists, even in the 50s, who, they weren't just producing prints, they were producing textiles, they were producing sculptures. Like, there is an incredible drive to create and to bring the verbal storytelling into object form, into image-based form, and sort of whatever material is best adept for that type of narrative. I think to siphon it off as sort of Inuit printmaking is only, or Inuit art is only printmaking or is only drawing, I think really leaves out a breadth of other narratives that, might be best displayed through painting or textiles, performance. I think it's really quite a broad spectrum of work that's being produced.
And as Pat said, much of Inuit art is storytelling, and for a very long time, the Inuit could not tell their own stories. Other people were telling their stories. So they very much are telling their stories through their art, whether it be sculpture or printmaking or drawing.
Yeah, and we were mostly like an oral culture. Like, we didn't really have a writing system until, the different regions were colonized and the writing was made, basically. So, and everything has meaning. All the crafts and different patterns and, tattoos and songs and stories. Yeah, so for me, it's just, it's not separate.
I also reminds me of this quote from Shuvenaya Shuna, if I can read it out loud. It says, I don't draw simply the surfaces of landscapes. I feel I am capturing the breath and soul of the earth. So I think that really just encompasses just the life and the stories that are full of that life.
I want to say also, and I'm going to come pass you my mic, just on the note of, there's another one. Oh, thank you. On the note of storytelling, I had so many interesting conversations with Asinayak in the context of the reinstallation of our Inuit art collection, because the stories that were told around the works and the way those stories were told was so important for her. To the extent that she wanted to, for her, letting the works kind of speak for themselves was very important. So it was important to her to limit the text, and she wanted to have one sentence for every word, and for every work. And it actually became like a story and a poem running throughout the exhibition. My instinct, and I'm so grateful for those times that we spent together, because my instinct as a museum professional who's thinking about our community, for thinking about people who, I mean, when I say our community, I mean the museum community of all the varied visitors who come through our doors, is also sharing and accessibility. So Asinayak and I talked a lot about how can we not feel like we're explaining away the kind of mystery and the beauty of these stories and their orality, but still providing certain anchor points for people so that they feel that regardless of what their background is, they can connect. So I just wanted to, again, underline the importance of her voice, and also my gratitude for shifting that perspective and also having the compromise, because I think she understood too. I said, we can't just have, one word that would mean something to you, but that other people aren't going to understand. So we had a lot of back and forth, and it was really rewarding. And I think having her voice, having Inuit voices involved in the project was really critical to its success in a way that on some level I'd always known, but hadn't really fully digested the magnitude of that importance until the project was complete. And a lot of that had to do with stories and the way that she, speaking for herself, speaking for her community, her family also, because I say her community and family because Jessica, you said, not one person can speak or should be put in a position of speaking for everyone. That was also important. We didn't want her to feel that way. She did not want to be that person. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because it was a very important experience for the museum as a whole. So anyway, somebody else had a question. There was also a question over there I saw, and then you. I think she was first, and then.
Oh, sorry. Okay. If this is particularly for Ed, if there's a consistency, if you see a consistency in storytelling in this particular culture in other mediums of storytelling, like in literature or dance or theater or film, within, because this culture seems to be less, excuse me, less universal than many others, in which there are other cultures that are disseminated more widely.
In terms of storytelling, the Inuit are starting to make films. It's a fairly new medium there. Theater, I'm not familiar with. They're doing theater now, so yeah, that's part of it. But the storytelling is part of the culture, but it used to be oral. And many of the works tell some kind of story visually. And one of the things I like about the work, yeah, it's the Arctic, and we're not really familiar with the Arctic, but the work shows our common humanity. So if I have a number of works that deal with alcoholism, which I'm sure the particular community wasn't thrilled that was put out there, that we have this problem in our community. But it makes us realize this is not just a problem that this community is having. We've all experienced in some way the problems of alcoholism. Either we've experienced it ourselves or someone in our family, a friend. So it speaks to, the artwork speak to our common humanity. And it's part of storytelling, the negative things and the positive things in the culture.
Yes.
Hello. I had a project on the coast of Labrador in the late 70s. And the television sets in these individual houses, this town of about 400 or so, were on from morning till night. And I was told I had just missed it because before television, There were community sing-alongs and knitting bees, and this wonderful cohesion had been lost because of television. Is this something that impacts the visual arts as well?
That's a very interesting question. Initially, well, first of all, when TV was first introduced in the North, there was at least one settlement that refused it, that wouldn't have it put in, Aglulik, which, interestingly enough, is sort of the home of filmmaking in the North now. So, you know, perhaps that does show that there was a negative effect. But I think for a long time, I think there was, in some cases with the younger people particularly, a real longing to be somewhere where they could be part of the activities that were there. But now much of the programming, in the same way that other parts of Inuit identity have been taken back by Inuit, is all in Inuktitut. I mean, their programming is done in the North, is aired in Inuktitut with English subtitles, and a lot of what you watch now is about traditional ways, how we used to do things, and I find it fascinating. I love watching IBC, so.
Yeah, sorry, I can't speak to that time really, but I think more detrimental to community was residential schools. So during those times, people were being taken, or children were being taken from their families and sent to...
Maybe you can just, sorry to cut you off, I think it's so important. It's a term that's very familiar to anyone in Canada, but that maybe not everyone knows here. So maybe you could, if you don't mind saying what the residential schools were, because it's a very important part and difficult part of the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Yeah, so like my grandmother was taken to a residential school. So when she was young, she lived like semi-nomadic. They had camps that they went to for different seasons and to do different things. But by the time she was like 6 or 7, she was taken from that lifestyle to Nain, which was a community with established schools and missionaries, and was forced to go to school away from her family. So that was the story for many children. My mom basically was just a little bit too young for that experience. So yeah, I think that probably put a big dent in the community.
And a lot of traditional practices too were banned, like
Yes.
tattooing, for example.
No Inuktitut.
Podlach.
Yeah.
Language
Gone. Yeah. Throat singing. Yeah.
I was told in Cape Dorset or in Kingite, someone once said that they referred to the lost generation, which was the group of people who were taken out and taken away from their parents and from the community. And when they eventually came back, they didn't know how to parent themselves. And that was when a lot of the alcohol and drug issues arose, and say that it was really fascinating to me to hear that was that lost generation. So fortunately, the grandparents very often then took the role that the parents should have taken. But again, just with sort of strength of the culture, this is all, it was horribly damaging. It's not happening anymore, but you cannot believe the social disruption that, that it made.
Thank you for sharing that. Other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, all of you. Thank you.